Right, well, good evening. My name is Steve Lucas. I work for Bat Conservation Trust, covering mainly species policy and legislation. But tonight I'm doing this virtual bat walk for you. I've no idea who's online. I can see two up the top there. So if anybody is there, then please do shout. Where are we this evening? Well, we're in my hometown of Ammanford, just outside Swansea, between Swansea and Carmarthen. Ammanford is quite an up-and-coming urbanised area. It's certainly changed a lot since I was here, since I came here some 30 years ago. But now behind me is a well-known soup stall where every little helps. Big car park, so you never know what we might hear behind us. But in front of me, about 50 metres away, 50 yards away, there is a large pipistrelle roost inside a residential care home. And this part of the river, I'm standing now right by the River Amman, in a nice area where the water is fairly slow moving. And this place this little area here in the next few minutes will get incredibly busy. In fact, I think I've just started hearing a bat flying about. I was here last Friday just checking it out, and from about 9:30 through to about 10 o'clock it was heaving with bats, absolutely heaving. Mainly pipistrelles, but we also get Daubenton's here, and I'm sure if we would stay a little bit longer we would get many other species. So as you can see, the habitat around here is really lovely. We have the slow moving water and the edges of the river. And there we go, there's our first bat of the evening, soprano pipistrelle. Say the edges of the river here are nicely vegetated, which all helps to provide lots of lovely insects, midges and mosquitoes for the bats to feed on. Again, hopefully you can hear that. So I think it's helpful to have some understanding of what bats are doing at this time of year. So here we are. Wow, it's just flown over the top of me. It's just headed down the river. We've also got swifts, I think it is, swallows flying above as well. So what are bats doing at this time of year? Well, it's maternity season now. Females will have congregated mainly back into their maternity roosts, ready to have their babies, their pups. Pups may already have been born by now, but we've not yet heard any. Yep. Steve, how can you tell the difference between the different pips? Do they register at different frequencies? I will come on to that very shortly. Let's just clear up where we are in the life cycle of bats. So this is the season now when the females will have adopted the best sites for having their babies, having their pups, and they will have their pups any time from now on, really, right the way through till about June, through into June, maybe July, depending on the season and how the weather's going. Before that, of course, bats will have been in hibernation over the winter time. There he comes again. And between sort of March, April time, when they come out of hibernation, bats will move into intermediate roosts, places where they can congregate, meet up again, and quite often they may stay there for a few weeks before then heading to their maternity sites. And funnily enough, my next door neighbour, from till a good few years ago, used to have a roost of about between 200 and 400 soprano pips. The bats would come at the beginning of May and leave at the end of May, and they would just disappear. Some of them, one or two of them would stay there and have their pups there. But what I now think is that they congregated at that roost at my next door neighbour's house before moving to the roost just over the river here for the main season. We believe in Ammanford here we've got two fairly large soprano pipistrelle roosts. So the bats then will have their pups. The pups will be free flying, certainly by the end of July. And that's when we often get lots of the telephone calls from people complaining about bats having come into their house. And that's because the youngsters haven't quite learnt where to get in and out of the bat roost. And then after the late summer into the autumn time, the bats start to disperse. We go into the breeding season when males will be starting to mate with the females. And that mating can take place right the way throughout the autumn time, even the winter and into the springtime. But the bats they have what's called delayed implantation. So although the egg may be fertilised, that's held back whilst the bat is in hibernation over the winter time. And it's a mechanism to make sure that the females can get through the winter without too much problem. So we can hear the bats, this call going on. So obviously a bit of a myth that bats can't see at all. Or as blind as a bat, absolutely nonsense. Bats have actually quite good eyesight. Won't always use echolocation unless they really need to. Echolocation is an incredibly energy demanding bit of activity. But obviously when you're a bat, you're flying at night, you're trying to find little insects, which is the size of a midge, mosquito, maybe a bit bigger for some other things. You've really got to have some mechanism to find that, to find your prey. And obviously if you're flying at night, it's dark, you need to have a torch so to see your way around. That's what we would use. We would turn the light on and use a torch to find our way around. Bats use echolocation. And it's a form of very high frequency sound which they chuck out from either their mouth or their nose, and then they listen for the call coming back, which will tell them where they are and what the food is, what the available food is that's around them. And different bats will have different types of echolocation calls, which we can use to a certain extent to identify the bats in the field. So we use a bat detector. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a bat detector. This is a way of bringing down that very high frequency call to something that's audible, that we can hear. And by tuning into that call, we can get an idea of what bats we're listening to. So how do we tell the difference between the pipistrelles? Well, we've got three pipistrelles in here in the UK. We have the soprano pipistrelle, the common pipistrelle, and then another pipistrelle called the Thusius, which has a fascinating history. So we'll come on to them perhaps a bit later on. But the two main pipistrelles are common and soprano, and these are the bats that people generally know about, because they're the bats that people see at this time of the evening as they've left the roost, and they have this fast flitty flight as they dart around chasing after insects. So the soprano pipistrelle will echolocate round about 55 kilohertz, and the common pipistrelle will echolocate round about sort of between 40 and 45 kilohertz. If I can just zoom in on here. So this is my a tablet which is connected to a USB microphone. There's the microphone, and you can see the calls coming in real time. So by using a simple bat detector like this little magenta that I've got here, just going to turn it down to 55 thereabouts. Whereas if I was to turn it down to 45, you'd get a slightly different sound. And you hear it's quite tinny. You turn it back up to 55, the sound becomes much stronger. So that will tell us what sort of pipistrelle bat we've got flying around here. How many bats do we have here in Great Britain, in Wales? Well, we have something like 17 species of bats that are known to breed, 18 species that are resident at some point in here. Right, we've got at least 2 or 3 of them now hunting over this water. Here in Wales we certainly have 15 species of bats. We have the 2 horseshoe bats, for which Wales is a particular stronghold. We have the 3 species of pipistrelle, common, soprano and Methusias. Methusias is a really interesting animal. It's a migratory bat. And it's been known that Methusias pipistrelles will migrate from places as far away as Latvia and follow their way down the European coastal regions, coastal areas, cross over the North Sea and across into England, Wales. And some studies have been shown, ringing studies recently, with Methusias pips from Bristol, in the Bristol area, and they turned up in Holland the following day or a couple of days later. These guys can really travel long distances. As I say, it's a migratory bat, and it has now started to take up residence in the UK. We have the myoted bats, a whole group of myoted bats, natteras, daurbentons we get here, whiskered and brants, Alcathoe. Now Alcathoe is a relatively new bat to our list, our species list. For quite a number of years, some researchers up in Leeds University were doing some work in the Dales there, and they were catching bats, and they were noticing that some bats were quite clearly whiskered, some were quite clearly brants, but one or two others looked slightly odd, slightly different. So some further research, including DNA, revealed that actually we had another myotid called Alcathoe, which was previously only known from Europe. Perhaps it's been here all along, we just don't know. We don't tend to catch bats unless we need to. Catching bats using nets is very distressing to them. So it's not something that's done lightly. It has to be done under license and only in exceptional circumstances. We have some long-eared bats, the brown long-eareds. There's a roost, a brown long-eared roost not too far from here. These are the guys that typically inhabit places like old churches, barns, houses with nice open spaces in their roofs, in the attics. Arguably, perhaps the cutest of all the bats are the long-eared bats. There's the grey long-eared bat, but that doesn't occur here in Wales. And there's a whole range of other bats. There's the big bats, the cerutins, the nocturals, the lyslers. Funnily enough, nocturals, we don't get many nocturals around this part of where I live. So quite a rare occasion, which is a bit strange given that nocturals are a tree-dwelling animal. Question, they are attracted by the river for feeding. Where do they roost? Nocturals are tree dwellers and it roost almost exclusively in trees. Occasionally they will go into houses and buildings, but that's quite rare. But pipistrelles are perhaps the bats that we most commonly associate with our buildings. They've adapted quite nicely to our way of life. But given there are supposed to be several million pipistrelles in Wales alone, I suspect that many of these bats actually do live in trees, outbuildings perhaps, culverts, the horseshoe bats during the summertime, maybe in barns, sometimes caves, but mainly barns, buildings like that. But come the winter time, they need a completely different set of features in order for them to hibernate. They need cool, stable, humid conditions. So very often these will be found in caves, underground systems. But during the summertime, they need the warmth and the heat. So the females will choose the best places. After all, they've got the most incentive to raise their young. I'm guessing more and more bats now coming in. The males probably get displaced to the... I mean, these bats are sort of almost flying around me. Yeah, the males probably, in many cases, get displaced. But the reality is we don't always know what's in a roost. We seem to think that the roost may contain females and their pups, their young, of course. But we don't honestly know that for certain. Bats have been around for millions and millions of years. The archaeological evidence, the fossil evidence shows certainly 50 million years. And their evolution is quite fascinating, something that we're still trying to work out. Sean's asked me, barbastels in the area, they are rare in Wales. I'm not certain the barbastels have been recorded around here, but barbastels are certainly widespread, but not very common, shall we say. Part of the problem with barbastels, it's a bit like some of the horseshoes, is you have to be quite close to you have to have your detector quite close to the bat to be able to actually detect them. And it may actually be they're a bit more common than we actually think. But barbastels are certainly associated with old ancient trees, which is where they quite often will roost, in trees, like gaps in trees and behind flaking bark and so on. They will use buildings, but they are mainly associated with ancient veteran trees. And of course, we don't have too many of them left. We have a special area of conservation over in North Pembrokeshire, Pengethley Forest, and some new maternity roosts have just recently been discovered in South Pembrokeshire. But it's one of probably survey effort more than anything else. I have no idea if you're seeing them flying around, but they're buzzing around now, flying up and down the river, along the edge of the river. There's one. Oops. Let's see if I can catch it on the video. There's a fish jumping. It's a real hotspot for bat activity. Yes, absolutely. If you want to go and see bats, if you want to go and hear bats, you go where the food is. And down by the river, slow moving water, well vegetated, are great places to see and hear bats. Of course, part of the problem is bats fly at night, and it's not always so easy to see them. Which is why you really need a bat detector to listen to them. And the other thing is, of course, that bats will come out at different times during the night. So the The pipistrelles and the nocturnes, they're quite happy coming out when it's light at sunset. They're both very, very fast flying and can evade predators nicely. But other bats like the myotis, like the dorbies, long-eared bats, the horseshoe bats, they're much slower flying. They don't have quite the same sort of agility, always have the same sort of agility, so they will wait till it's darker, much, much darker. It's a safety mechanism. I really have no idea what you're seeing now. It is certainly getting quite dark. How did I first get interested in studying bats? I have always been interested and fascinated with wildlife, ever since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. This has been, as my brothers used to refer to me, my nerdy subject. I would quite often go off, take myself off when I was a young lad on my bicycle riding around the commons of Surrey, looking at birds, looking at butterflies. Bats were not really a feature, but they were just part of the general wildlife. But it was not until I started, you will have just heard then the echolocation calls, that sort of wet sucking sound that we're listening to. And then all of a sudden you had that bzz, that buzz. That's what we call a feeding buzz. And that was the bats homing in on an insect. And when you hear that bzz, that's the end of the insect. Yeah, so my real passion is probably insects, to be quite honest. The trouble with insects is there are so many of them. And trying to keep your minds up to date with, say, 2,500 species of butterfly and moth is quite a task. Whereas when you're dealing with bats, you're only really dealing with, as we've already said, perhaps 15 species of bat. Much easier. And the other thing I think is, because I've been in protected species management for the last 20 odd years, you get to help people who have problems with bats. Not everybody likes bats, and sometimes they can cause problems for people, and you really want to help them. You want to have a situation where people and bats can live together nicely, harmoniously, and it's always nice to be able to go and help somebody who's perhaps got a problem with bats. They may have a roost. I've known bat roosts, pipistrelle roosts, for example, up to 1,000, 1,500 animals. And that causes problems for some people, the smell, the noise. But they're a fascinating group of animals. There's a huge amount of bat we still have to learn. Of course, COVID hasn't helped at all. Some people still think that bats have caused COVID. They haven't. People have caused COVID. But they're an important group of animals. They sit at the top of the food chain. They take the place of birds at night. They're helping to keep the insects in control, keep the midges and mosquitoes down, which is always a good thing. And they're incredibly important in the ecosystem. Go to places like mid-America, South America, Mexico. They're incredibly important for pollination. Without bats, you wouldn't have tequila. So that's your tipple. So they really are a very, very important group of animal. Sean says, I never knew they lived in such high densities. Certainly if I get a phone call and somebody says, I've got hundreds of bats living in my attic, what can I do about it? Do I need to do about it? Whatever. Straight away you start thinking about you've probably got soprano pipistrelles. But if you take bat like brown long-eared bat, maybe a dozen bats, for example, would constitute quite an important bat roost. At the moment we're in the middle of the National Bat Monitoring Programme for counting our summer roosts. Last Sunday I was at a lesser horseshoe bat roost, counted 123, which was fantastic. That was down on the Gower. Last night I was counting at another roost just outside Swansea, counting about 40. So numbers can vary tremendously, and these guys can move around the landscape and do move around the landscape. So although the main roosts for soprano pits, which is just about 50 metres away from here, the numbers can go up and down from one year to the next, depending on the weather conditions. Somebody I know who lives just outside Llandilo, they used to count 300, 400, 500 pipistrelles. The last few years they've had none. Don't know why. Maybe they've just found somewhere else. And certainly the roost next door to me, as I say, some years it was 200, 300, other years it was just a handful, half a dozen or so. And the bats would be somewhere else. So they're constantly moving around the landscape. And that makes it really difficult sometimes for us to sort of think about conservation measures. Or it makes it challenging, should I say, about conservation measures. What do we do? How long does a bat live? Well, out in the wilds, it can vary. Obviously, bats are fascinating parts. We tend to think of small mammals as being short-lived. If you think of creatures like mice, voles, they probably only live, or they do only live just for a couple of years. But we know that bats can live quite a long time. And the oldest recorded bat so far, I think was a whiskered or a brant that had been caught. This was going back a few years ago. It had a ring on it, and that ring had been put on 40 years before. So that bat was at least 40 years old. That's probably an exception. Most bats probably don't live more than 5, 6, 7, 8 years, 10 years, depending on whether they get through the first few years of life. But they're a long-lived animal. Bats are a social animal, incredibly social. And they live in groups, and they communicate with each other. They get to know their places, they know their patch. And very often bats do actually tend to return back to the same roost year after year after year. Well, they certainly live in the same area year after year after year. So here we have an animal that's long-lived. It has high energy expenditure, and yet if it suffers any injuries, tears in its wings are capable of repairing very quickly. We know of very few diseases associated with bats that bats will succumb to. And this really has big implications for human health. Why do bats not get sick? Some do obviously get sick with things like rabies, and bats have their own particular type of rabies. It's not the rabies that we associate with cats and dogs and other mammals. They have their own special European bat virus, but they don't succumb to the same illnesses and diseases as humans do. and they live a long, long time. So there are researchers, a group of researchers over in Dublin under Professor Emma Teeling, who's doing a lot of work into bat longevity and trying to understand why is it that bats can live, a small mammal like a bat can live so long without getting apparently sick. So we have both common and soprano pipistrelles buzzing around now. Let's just see how that. So you see the real strong calls there, those are soprano pipistrelles. So you can tell from the shape of that call that that's a pipistrelle. They have these hockey stick shaped calls. So bats emit echolocation calls, and those are the calls that we've been listening to. But they also have a whole range of calls that they learnt that they use to communicate with each other. Some of that may be to say, follow me guys. Some of it may be to say, get out of the way, this is my patch. Some calls may be distress calls. So there's a whole range of other calls that bats make. It's all not just the echolocation call. This is what we're listening to here. Do they ever hybridize? Not that I'm aware of, is the honest answer. I think the definition of a species is that it can't actually hybridize. But I'm not aware that bats hybridize. Certainly when it comes to a bat roost, you can get more than one species type of bat occupying a bat roost, either at the same time. A few years ago, some of us were at the Knoll Park just outside Neath. We were looking at a tree, a big beech tree, in which there were about 90 noctules would come out of that. And then shortly after that, a whole load of Daubenton's, so they came out of the same exit. So these bats, two different species of bat using the same roost. So you can get multiple occupancy at the same time. And of course the other thing you can get is when bats have finished using a roost and leave it, sometimes that gives the space for other bats to come in, other species, so you can get multiple species at different times. So no, I'm not aware, Sean, that pipistrelles hybridize at all. As I said earlier on, we're in the middle of just started the National Bat Monitoring Programme. This is the longest mammal monitoring programme in the UK. It shows that most of our bats appear to be, for those that we monitor at least, are doing okay. The horseshoe bat seems to be improving. Their status is improving. Other bats at least holding their own. Why is that? Partly the legislation helps. People are much more aware about bats and the need to protect them. But there's also a range of other things that are going on to try to conserve them. Agri-environment schemes to help farmers manage their land more appropriately. There's always more that we can do, but things certainly seem to be on the up for bats, which is good at the moment. But if people want to get involved, the most simple monitoring that we do is the sunset survey, where you simply go outside with a bat detector and look and watch and wait for bats. There are local bat groups in Wales. How can people get involved? So in Wales we have about 15 bat groups covering every county, every part of Wales. Some are more active than others. If you want to find out your local bat group, just pop onto the Bat Conservation Trust website, www.bats.org.uk, and you can find your local bat group there and get in touch with them. Many of them are very, very busy, particularly now as people are out doing monitoring, so might not get a response straight away. But they're the best way to get out and learn about bats, to go out with people who've got experience of bats, know what they're listening to, know what they're seeing. So we have the roost count, the sunset survey, which is the easiest one you can do. The other easy one to do is the roost counts, where you find a known roost. If you've got a roost at home, or you know somebody's got a bat roost, you simply sit outside one evening, you wait for the bats to come out, and when they come out, you start counting them. You send the results into Bat Conservation Trust, and then we collate all that information, and that all then goes to the statisticians, the people who do the stats, and we can then tell how bat populations are doing. We're constantly looking at our national bat monitoring programme and seeing how we can improve things. And we've got some exciting new projects coming up fairly shortly, one of which will be called the British Bat Survey, where you'll be able to borrow a little bat detector from us, leave it out, record overnight for a few nights, upload your files, and we will send you back the results. It really is getting very, very dark here now, and you probably can't see anything. Let's just see. So urban bats and urban bat ecology is a fascinating topic. How bats are using many of our buildings. Let's face it, if we were to go back 10,000 years ago, we invaded their space, we invaded their caves. And then when we made our homes out on the plains to bats, that was just another cave, and they just followed us. So we've had a long, long association with bats for thousands and thousands of years. And then obviously more recently, more historic times, obviously as human beings have expanded, created our towns, our cities, our villages, bats have just followed us. And for some people that's fine, others quite happily tolerate them. And sadly, for some people just still don't like bats at all. And we get persecution. It still happens, unfortunately. But they are incredibly important. They're part of our ecosystem. We're part of their ecosystem, to be quite honest, if we were to look at it in that context. Why are they called bats? That's a good question. I've no idea why they're called bats, but their Latin name is Chiroptera. And actually, when you look at, if you were to look at the wing of a bat, half of that wing is its hand, and Cairo means hand, terra is wing, and the bat is flying basically with its hand. And it's something I quite often do with children. If I'm talking to children, I get them to look at perhaps the size of their feet and compare it to the size of their hand. And then ask them to do the same with a bat and compare. The bat's foot is much, much smaller than its hand. And if you then say to the child, if you had hands the same proportion to your feet as bats do, we would have hands and arms about 10 to 12 feet across. But it's that winged hand that allows them to fly, that allows them to twist and turn. Bats are the only mammals that show true flight. That's another reason why people sometimes perhaps don't get to grips with bats. Mammals don't fly, do they? Birds fly, butterflies fly. But mammals don't. There's three fly just gone over the top of us. So we have an animal that flies at night, which people don't tend to see until the last second. It flies. And here in the Western civilization, if indeed we can call it a civilization, there are all sorts of myths and fables about bats being harbingers of prophecy of doom and death, bringers of disease. Whereas if you go over to the Far East, bats are revered. They're considered to be bringers of good health and wealth and fortune. Well, I can't see anything on my screen now, so I'm pretty certain you can't. So I'm wondering whether we should call this a night. The amount of activity, of bat activity, they're flying all over the top of me, around the side, in front of me. I've seen bats flying in the day even after settled weather. Any reason for this? But bats certainly will fly in the day if they get disturbed. Very often, particularly in the winter time when the weather suddenly warms up, just because bats when they go into hibernation, they're not like bears that go to sleep for 6 months at a time and wake up again. These bats are constantly sleeping, going into deep sleep. They will sleep for maybe a couple of weeks, a month maybe, but they will come back out of hibernation a bit. If the weather changes, it becomes too warm or it becomes too cold, they will need to find another place, a better, safer place to hibernate. So you may see them during the winter time. But in the summertime, sometimes if their roost gets too hot, they need to find somewhere that's cooler. If they've been unable to feed because the weather in the previous nights has been very wet, they do need to get out and feed. It's critical, particularly at this time of year. If you think that a bat has, over winter, has been using up all its fat reserves, for a female it's absolutely critical that she puts on weight in order that she can actually become pregnant and carry her pregnancy. So she may need to come out during the daytime and feed. It's a risky strategy. They can get predated on by birds. But it's a strategy, it's an approach they have to take. Well, you certainly can't see anything now, I'm afraid. So I am going to suggest that we perhaps finish for tonight. And so unless there's any other questions, I think we will call it an end. So I'm going to say thank you for joining in. If you want to find out more about bats, do have a look at the Bat Conservation Trust website. There are also lots of other good, really great websites. There's a Tesco delivery van. Just Googling bats, you'll find lots and lots of really great websites. A lot of the bat groups have really some fascinating information about their local bats. Bristol University has got some great information about bats in general. But do have a look at the BCC website. Everything you need to know is there. So with that, I'm going to bid you good night. Thank you.